Okay.
Always uncertainty and the measurements and so forth. The US and Canada together, they're about 15.6%. Europe is about 13.8%. Asia is about 58.6%. And I put that thing at the bottom. It's kind of another tongue-in-cheek comment. Sinners are going to sin, some more than others. So I think we all know what I mean by that. And so next slide. And just some more things to note about the overall total, just to kind of put numbers in perspective here. The anthropogenic emissions are around 10% of what of the total carbon cycle. So the Earth absorbs and emits by natural processes carbon dioxide and takes in some of what we put into the atmosphere, right? And we actually produce about twice as much as nature is currently absorbing. And again, there's uncertainty, but that's what the best available data at the time seems to indicate. And it seems to suggest that it's a rate problem. You slow down the rate, nature will eventually catch up. That's my theory anyway. And next slide. And this is not myth versus reality. This is perception versus reality. There's a difference there. And we have some ideas that we need to decarbonize the energy use in the Arctic to mitigate climate change. And okay, at 2.4% of the emissions total, and I'm leaving Russia out of this because they're going to do what they're going to do. Energy use in the Arctic is a very small piece of the overall contribution. You could take us out of the equation and it would not affect things a whole lot. That's just the reality of it. We need to stop climate change, to save the fragile Arctic environment is another perception that often comes up. And the reality is what we do in the Arctic has little to do with the effects and the consequences of what the rest of the world does. So if we decide that we're going to really hurt ourselves because we want to go green, and it seems like a noble thing to do, but then we freeze. That's not good. And the next slide, and it's going to be a disaster. We need to stop drilling because the cost is too high. Well, okay, if that's true, we need to prepare accordingly. And this is where the data gaps come in. Do we actually know this, and to what extent? And it's also a question of degree. How bad and how bad and when? These are a lot of open-ended unanswered questions that I think are giving people anxiety, and these are data gaps that we probably need to work on filling. And if we're going to adapt, we need money to adapt. If everyone's poor, nobody cares. So economic development is a necessary prerequisite to that. So I'm taking more of a pragmatic approach here. I hope people understand that, not to be misunderstood. And the next slide is these are some why we should not versus why we should. And these are arguments that people put out there. Why we should not? It's expensive. It's pointless. It's a leftist pipe dream. Why would you even think about that? And well, actually, the cost depends on the technology and approach. If you have a good of it and how cheaply you can get it out of the ground, there's still going to be a cost built into that. And the next slide, the energy costs are already really high up here. And it's not just because of the oil price. It's also because of transportation. It's because of logistical issues. And, you know, if we're forced to rely on renewables exclusively, well, we don't get as much sunlight up here as you do down in the south. So guess where everyone's going to want to move? We're going to move where the energy prices are better. We're going to want to move where the climate isn't so cold that you need so much energy to heat your home. So you're going to see a mass exodus of people from the Arctic to the north, moving southward. That's going to be very bad for our place up here. And next slide. And this comes down to how we two block ourselves. You know, it's a sailing term where you basically stretch the sail so much and you pull that block of tackle where the two blocks are butt to each other and can't move anymore. Ignore the situation or refuse to adapt because it's not real or not worth it or doesn't affect us a whole lot. And then we just keep doing what we're doing forever, or what we think is forever. And then we keep hoping for another oil boom to give us what we need, sustenance and economic development. You know, there's bumper stickers from the 1970s and 80s that say that. And they're on people's old rusty beat up pickup trucks up here. Please give us more oil boom. Yeah, we got more, and look where we're at now. So it's just something to keep in mind. And the next slide. And then we wait till the oil industry is in a permanent state of decline and blame our politicians for taxing carbon, not letting us drill. And we beg and plead for relief as our economy shrivel up and die. And to remember the glory days and cry about them because there's no hope. That's a very pessimistic way to look at it. But that's what happens when you don't think ahead. We don't have vision. We don't think ahead. When you don't say, you know what, this is what we're doing now. We're probably not going to be able to do this 20 years. We need to have a plan. And it's something that Bob has been talking about over and over again. We need a plan. Not just a mad rush to see who can put up the most wind turbines and solar panels first. So next slide is there's a better way to go about this. And that's you get qualified engineers involved early. Because many of them have actually been thinking about this for a very long time. Some have been trying, others have been doing their own experiments. And you try to come up with a plan. And you figure out what's realistically going to work and what's not going to work. And I have to say this, and this is a little bit sensitive to some people. You got to put the ideology aside here. You got to be pragmatic. And there's a reason for it I will address here in another slide here. Because philosophical ideals do not keep the lights and heat up. People got to stay warm, people got to stay fed, people got to stay comfortable enough that they actually want to live here, or the place just dies. So another slide. And then the energy cost is going to be a major factor in the acceptance or reject of any plan, right? So if we're going to execute a plan, people have got to accept the cost of it. And if they don't like the cost, it's not going anywhere. And there will be an inevitable decline of the oil and gas industries in the future. That means we need other industries. We can't have those without energy. So right now, a big emerging sector of the industry, maybe it's just a boom, maybe it's just a craze, I don't know. I like to think that it's going somewhere good, is the evolution of AI. Well, that requires more energy than just about any other IT effort we've ever done. In terms of telecommunications, the amount of power we've got to pipe into servers, it's crazy. We're talking megawatts and megawatts and megawatts per data center, sometimes more than that, sometimes hundreds of megawatts. I've heard some insane numbers that are just hard for me to believe because I'm thinking about the wire sizes and the voltages you need to transfer that amount of power to these things. And these are things we need to keep in mind. And, you know, a low energy economy is not going to do that for us. So next slide. And so we're talking about kind of the situation, but then we have our own sets of challenges that kind of get in the way. The Arctic is sparsely populated. That is true of Alaska. It's true of Canada. And it's true of many other places of the Arctic. And it makes connecting communities difficult. When communities are 70 or 80 miles apart, and there's 200, 300 people in those communities, sometimes maybe a couple thousand people in those communities, it's not really economical to run power lines from them. Usually not, at least not yet. And it reduces the economies of scale and increases costs. So your power generation projects become smaller. and more cost intensive for the amount of energy that they deliver. We have some really extreme winters up here. Short daylight hours. That doesn't help us during the wintertime for solar. Cold temperatures, they make everything more difficult. It makes stuff brittle. It makes it hard to work. And then you got snow accumulation. So if you got a big blanket of snow on a big field of solar panels, someone's going to go sweep that off. And who's going to want to do that if they're trying to shovel their driveways? And you got intermittent wind that makes wind turbines somewhat unreliable. And you got access challenges. Many places they're only accessible by sea and air. And qualified personnel service equipment are expensive. And you got to either want them to live someplace or you got to commit to being able to bring them in. Well, you know, Murphy's Law says that you're going to have a problem with the weather's the worst, and that's going to be when the airport's weather if you can't get in there. So how do you figure that out? And then we got changes in the permafrost of the active layer. And a lot of that's just uncertainty. You can engineer to anything if you know what you're dealing with. But what are we actually dealing with here? To what degree have we actually measured and validated models to help us understand how we would build something from a practical standpoint? Next slide. This is just right here. I actually pulled this from another presentation I did or tried to do a few years back about advocating for nuclear power here in Alaska. And I was just trying to show kind of what our generation mix is up here. You can see that hydroelectric and non-electric renewables, we've already got a pretty high share of them. But petroleum and natural gas are still dominant up here. So we're making strides in that direction. We're just not where we want to be yet. Next slide. And these are some of the challenges in what we call the rail belt, which is basically urban Alaska, and really a lot of us like to refer to it as maybe the world's largest microgrid. Because from north to south, it's a few hundred miles, and it's islanded from everything else around it. And there's multiple entities involved. They have their own interests. A lot of times utilities don't get along very well. And sometimes those fights, they go back a long ways, longer than I've been in engineering. And there tends to be conflicting planning goals when people don't work together. And there's also a lack of funding. So you can come up with a great idea for how to do something, and everyone's like, okay, yeah, great idea, Sonny. Who's going to pay for it? Like, I don't know. Maybe the state? Yeah, well, the state's broke. Who's going to pay for it? Okay, I'm not sure how to answer that question, because the initial revenue from a lot of what we built it here came from what? Oil and gas. During the 1970s and 80s, that transformed our economy. And in doing that, we were able to actually afford to build the infrastructure that now everyone fights over what to do with, or maybe not fights, but you know, it's kind of getting old. We know there need to be some changes, and we're trying to figure out what we need to do to make that happen. And I say lack of ownership, maybe it's more like this utility owns this piece of it, this utility operates it, this other utility owns this piece that's attached to it. There's always joint ownership agreements that sometimes make it hard to coordinate efforts. And I've got some humorous stories about some of those situations I've run into when I worked at MLMP. So next slide. And I like to say that studies are where ideas go to die, because you can make a study, you can come up with a compelling case, put the report on someone's desk, and that gets tossed into a file cabinet, and they slam the door shut and never sees the light of day again. And there's resistance to power pooling up here. I don't know why, but I think it has something to do with different utilities having their own interests and just the way the market works out up here. And NIMBY, not in my backyard. You know, so if you're going to build a power line or even a cell tower, we run this a lot with cell towers, there's going to be opposition. People don't want it in their backyard. Even if it's not in their backyard, even if it's outside their property line, but it obstructs their view, they don't want it there. So this is actually part of the reason why one of our biggest hydro projects we're thinking of doing this is sitting on Watana Hydro Project. We spent a long time, I think a couple decades planning it. It never materialized because in the end, some of the people in the area, 4 minutes, 4 decades. Whoa, that's a long report. Wow. Yeah, so I mean, it was before he was going to die. So it was a long time planning. And the idea was that it could supply most of the energy that we need in the rail belts, drastically reduce our dependence on natural gas, reduce our emissions, and make long-term reliable energy affordable for most Alaskans. Well, except when you dam up a river, it does something to the fishing. People don't like that. So they had a lot of tourism. There's a lot of opposition in the local area. And ultimately, it's like a $5.7 billion project for a 300 megawatt dam. And I think 300 was about what it would produce given the capacity factor. It was actually supposed to be like a 500 or 600 megawatt dam, but bigger capacity factor for hydroelectric, and yeah, it's not looking so good at that point. And this is the case almost anywhere in our society, as connected as we are with social media, with anyone being able to write letters to the editor. That's been a thing for a long time, and it's far too easy for anyone with an opinion to obstruct something because they don't like it. They don't want their taxes going up. They don't want to see that eyesore in their backyard, or maybe they think it's an environmental risk, and maybe it is. So that complicates things. Next slide. And out in the rural Alaska, we have different challenges. We have more microgrids in the other state. I grew up in Dillingham, and that's what a diesel generator is. That is among one of several diesel generators that my dad started to help install at Ushigak Electric when he was there, and they continue to upgrade that power plant since then. So all the Arctic specific challenges are often exacerbated in the bush, and the funding of the project is a challenge. So next slide. Diesel is a fuel choice. Like you said, you can transport it, but you need several million gallons of it for a reasonably sized community in a year. I remember as a kid standing on the city dock of Dillingham, watch the barge come in, and it would have to do it over a period of 3 or 4 tides, offload about 1.6 to 1.8 million gallons of diesel fuel through a hose about this big, up the dock, up the pier, into the terminal. And it would take several hours, and then as the tide was going down, they'd have to disconnect it, pull the hose back, pull the barge away from the dock, wait till the next tide, and do it. And you think about all the connecting and disconnecting and the risk of a spill, plus you got a pipe running. Yeah, there's just, you could do it, but there's risks there. And if we're worried about carbon emissions, diesel's only slightly better than coal in terms of raw emissions. And when you count the cost of transporting it, it's even worse. So it's a prime target for future carbon taxation. And that's just going to hurt these guys and everyone else out there. And if you're having to fly your fuel in, you could be in trouble. Next slide. And so everyone's challenges kind of boil down to something here. In the bush, the move toward renewables is driven by a desire to save on diesel costs. In urban areas, people tend to be resistant to anything that's going to increase their costs. They prefer the status quo because they perceive it to be cheaper. It's always cheaper to do nothing. And you may recognize this guy, Jimmy McMillan, the founder of a single issue party in New York, and ran for mayor over the cost of rent. And he's become a meme for anything that costs too much in people's minds. And the next slide. We're a bunch of greenies up here. We really are. We want to keep green in our pockets. You know, I know Canadians, you guys have much more colorful money than we do. So I like your money, by the way. It's really cool looking. But it's like, well, what do we get out of this? For all this effort we put into trying to decarbonize and make our environment cleaner, what do we get out of this? What's in it for us? All it's going to do is cost more money, and everyone else is just going to do what they're going to do, and we're going to suffer for it. So why? Next slide. So here's some thoughts along these lines. It's more about thinking strategically. It's not about preventing a catastrophe so much. It's about thinking, okay, strategically, well, what do we want to do here? We want to future-proof energy supplies because it's kind of hard to maintain the way it is, and we don't want our economy crippled by future carbon taxes and mandates. And we also want to ensure reliability because people will die if energy is not reliable. If you live in the Southwest, you may die of a heat stroke. Up here, you can freeze to death. We've got hypothermia.
And by the way, cold temperatures kill a lot more people than warm temperatures do, which is why historically people used to live more in the warmer climates, and not as many people live north. We want to provide low-cost energy because low-cost energy is necessary for modern economies to prosper, and it's going to be even more important in the future. And we do not want to drive businesses out of our state. We want our state to be business attractive because being poor is not good. You know what? You know who cares the least about the environment? Somebody who's scraping by paycheck to paycheck. Where I lived in Dillingham, people didn't really care as much. It's gotten a lot better, but littering used to be a common problem. Our landfill became the biggest tourist attraction of the town because it's where the bears showed up. Because you had a big pile of garbage, the bears would scavenge it there. It's not like that now, but it was when I was a kid. And you know, and we want to reduce carbon emissions because it's kind of the goal on a global scale, but also because you got carbon taxation. And if you're out of sync with what's going on, then you're looked at as being backward, and it may not be a business-friendly thing in the long term. And Bob Sykes put me on this. I thank him so much for this, by the way. And this is a short story that was written by Jack London. It's maybe 5-10 pages long. You can pull it up online and read it if you want to. I recommend everybody does. And this is a story about a guy who went hiking to get from point A to point B and didn't really think ahead when he did it. And he got cold and tried to build a fire. And because he hadn't planned ahead and had thought ahead, the fires kept going out. His hands got to the point where he couldn't use them. And eventually he died because he froze to death after trying to light about 3 or 4 fires and having them go out each time. And if you don't plan ahead, you don't think ahead, the consequences can be pretty severe up here. And we can't forget about the heating needs. We tend to focus on solar and wind. All those do is provide electricity. And you need a lot more heat than you need electricity up here. Electricity is just a part of the picture. Next slide. And the focus should be on adaptation primarily. And changes in geopolitics, whether we're talking carbon taxation, policies, we want to make our place policy proof in a sense. And mitigation should be a byproduct of this. And I say this, you know, because right now this is our economy. You know, we need to stop trying to kill the oil and gas industries before we have viable alternatives working. If we don't actually have alternatives, then it's not a solution. We need to work on the alternatives and get them working, because the only thing worse than dirty energy is energy poverty. Where are people dying of disease? Where you don't have electricity, you don't have clean running water. Where are people poor and miserable? Where you don't have energy. So we don't want people to be poor and miserable. We want people to be resilient and adaptable. Next slide. So when we're talking about solutions for the Arctic, ideally we want our solutions to be able to produce heat and power, and it'd be nice if they're dispatchable. Because if you are running a wind turbine or a big field of them, and the wind starts dying down, you need to be able to predict or react to that. And you can't do that if all your sources are dependent on Mother Nature to supply what you can get out of it. And it'd really be nice if they weren't tied to geography, because if they are, we're in a dilemma of trying to see how many miles of transmission line we can afford to build and where to. Some communities are just going to get left out if that's what you do, because it's not going to be economical. And we don't want to be dependent on changes in the environment to produce our energy for us. If we can get energy from the environment, okay, great. But what if it's not there? Energy needs are usually highest when the frigid air is calm and the sky is dark, and both are bad for wind and solar. Next slide. So things that might work up here, you know, wind, solar, and hydroelectric are the classic top 3. Hydroelectric has actually had the most success up here. And the second most successful one, but it's only been on small scales like Sheena Hot Springs and others, has been geothermal. But there's another one coming up that I think could be better than all of them because of the fact that you don't necessarily have to tie to geography. That's nuclear. Some like to say small modular reactors because people don't like the nuclear word anymore. And there's some efforts underway. Go to the next slide. Geothermal nuclear, the big advantage that nuclear has over geothermal is it's not as geographically constrained. You know, geothermal, unless you're gonna drill to the center of the earth, you're down 30 kilometers or something, you need to be near a heat source. And we have them up here, but they're not everywhere. So, next slide. And next slide. Eielson Air Force Base, they actually put out an RFP to have a small modular reactor installed at their base. That is something that's currently in progress in terms of the contracting. We don't yet know what's going to become of that, but if it works, and you know, I hope and pray that it does, it could be the first of many. And we're talking about small modular reactors, talking about things that are in the range of a few megawatts as opposed to a few hundred megawatts or gigawatts. So they're a lot more rightly sized to the community. Some of you who know anything about it, just like, well, what if your load's only 3/4 of a megawatt? I'm like, okay, that's 3/4 of a megawatt of electricity, plus probably the equivalent of 2 or 3 megawatts of heating oil that you're using to keep things warm and everything else. So it becomes a lot more of a practical solution to electrify things if you have an abundance of energy. Or you could just use the waste heat and use that to heat your homes and businesses. So that's some thoughts there. That's why I tend to be pro-nuclear. I think it's going to be, if we can make it work, it's probably one of the best solutions we have in the toolbox. But we need to work on that. And I think that's the end of the presentation. Is it? I think so. Oh, there's two more slides. So yeah, concluding remarks. I think I probably addressed them all, but basically, we need to find something that's going to work if it's going to be enough with the summary point to this.
Yeah, thank you very much. And for the benefit of the online participant, so please use microphones when you ask questions. One question actually. For the minutes, let me take the battery.
Let me use your.
Sure.
Sure. So there was a lot of discussion earlier about the artifacts of AI. I just wanted to spell that a little bit and say that the AI component of energy use is actually, but once it's deployed, if you look at some of the keynotes that have come at Qualcomm delivered in the last couple of months, they expect the AI implementation to be a mobile solution, which is essentially a very low power device. The training. Now, if I think about that and say, okay, in a perfect world, if we could train an AI to handle the monitoring, the high level monitoring of an SMR, I think there's a solution to use that in a remote sense based on our conversation yesterday when I don't remember who mentioned it and said, the problem with putting small MRs throughout Alaska is there's nobody there. You know, there's no control room operator at every place to actually handle that. So I think having an AI solution on top of the SMR might be something that is of interest. So I don't know if you want to comment on it, but I agree the implementation is is energy non-efficient and it requires a lot, but I don't think you would do that in Alaska. I think you would train those things somewhere in the lower 48 and then use those AI solutions, you know, in Alaska on a SMR that's deployed remotely. Anyway.
Yeah, I think you're largely correct about that. And there's been a lot of discussion about automating these small modular reactors. I don't know if they've specifically used the term AI to describe that, but definitely automating it and reducing the amount of operator intervention that's needed to make them run safely. Of course, there's always a challenge of getting regulators to buy off on that. I think it's probably going to take a new generation of regulators, but they're coming. So there's hope.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Nolan.
Nolan, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Down to earth, real. One observation, you presented a table with the alternative methods of energy. I think one is missing, oil. See, I like to see oil as something, as a base that you reduce gradually as you implement alternatives. So you always have the supply that you need, and the more alternatives you implement, you reduce the oil consumption.
Yeah, I agree with you there on some level. I think that when you're talking about reduction, you want to reduce things that you know you can reduce. You know, stationary energy consumers are the most easily electrified and the most easy to implement with things like district heating and stuff. And that's, if you look at the pie chart, that's actually a huge fraction of the overall picture. You could, if everything that was like, say, homes and businesses and stuff was electric and heated with steam from reactors or some other source, you know, you wouldn't really need much natural gas distribution. You wouldn't need much of that at all. And so it's really a question of what's practical and what makes the most sense to do and when. And yeah, I think you're on the right track there.
If you combine the renewables properly with some artificial intelligence algorithm, whatever, if you combine the renewables properly, you can reduce the separation between peak demand and average demand. So you can make lots of improvements. You can also add storage, but all of that you can do with the peace of mind of knowing that you will not be cold.
Yes.
I actually had a similar question on the same lines because, you know, what you're really doing is you're looking for an alternative solution, but the people that gotta lose are the oil industry. So they don't want to reduce it, right? So are they an elephant in the room? Are they a counterbalance to all the other efforts that are being put together?
I'm not an oil.
Dumb question. I don't know.
Yeah, they gotta stay warm too. I think it's more I think the answer is more complicated than that. It's hard for me as someone who hasn't worked in the oil industry to speak to that. So.
Okay. I was just going to give you an example. If you're creating a new solution as a startup company in whatever business, right? If you're taking somebody's job away, they're going to be a counterbalance. And that's what got me thinking is if you're trying to find all these solutions and the huge oil industry is saying, no way in hell are we going to go there, right? That could be something you got to keep in mind and somehow incentivize them. It's in their interest to create the SMRs, right?
You know, there's a guy by the name of Michael Sheldberger who wrote a book called Apocalypse Never, and there's stuff to agree with and stuff to disagree with in that book, but he does talk about the history of opposition to nuclear power in the 70s, and he presents some evidence from his standpoint that oil industries did interfere with the development and the licensing and the siting of nuclear power plants, specifically in California during the 1970s and 80s. Now, I haven't been able to verify that independently. I wouldn't be terribly surprised though.
Well, I can only recommend Oliver Stone's Nuclear Now movie, like the documentary, I should say. It goes through this entire process of interference, etc. Yeah, just one sec. I was gonna ask you to introduce yourself because.
Hi, I'm Amy Servant. I'm an electrical engineer at Alaska Village Electric Cooperative. I apologize. I am sick yesterday and today. I listened in online yesterday, really good discussions, and I'm presenting this afternoon. But I'm trying to keep my distance because I don't want to get anybody else sick either. Two comments on Nolan's talk. Thank you, Nolan. One is that there are a couple things going on. You mentioned the difficulty of getting multiple utilities along the rail belt to work together. There are some efforts by the Regulatory Commission of Alaska to establish a separate entity for managing the transmission of power, or being what they call ISO, Independent System Operator. I don't follow that very closely because I don't work on the rail belt, but I know that is part of this discussion as well, in terms of, well, how can we move forward with this system. And then another thing that's in the works right now is called RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard. A majority of states have some sort of standard to get to X amount of renewables by X year or something like that. But one unique approach that Alaska has been taking is actually cost-based. Instead of demanding a certain amount of renewables, saying that the cost of energy has to be lowered to X by year X. And the assumption is that when you have renewables in place, your cost of energy can go down in spite of the upfront investment that is required. And so there is a lot of discussion going on in the legislature, a lot of national labs. Someone particularly at NREL is involved with modeling that possibility. So.
Thank you
Yeah,
very
thanks.
much. That's great. And I guess taking a longer term financial assessment makes much more sense than just focusing on the initial investment. Right? That also applies to the nuclear piece.
Yes, very much so.
Would you like to make a
Yes. So the question is, unsure about Alaska, but in Canada's north, we see a lot of opposition to hydro, especially where you would have a reservoir, less due to it being in their backyard. But instead, for these communities, many of them indigenous, there's an important connection to the land. The destruction of large swaths of land is the destruction of part of their physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. To freezing, okay. Mr. King, is there in Alaska? Okay, I'll answer the first part there first. Yeah, we have a similar issue up here, and it really depends on where. I mean, I don't know of any time we've ever talked about a hydroelectric project where there hasn't been some kind of opposition of that nature or some kind of concern of that nature. And there's actually been a lot more of it recently with any sort of project that we've thought about doing. So yes, that is a thing, that is a concern. And it's part of the reason why I don't say I've given up on hydro despite really liking hydro, but it's just one of those things that's kind of unworkable for what we're trying to do. I mean, it could be workable, don't get me wrong, and if we could get it, it would be great, but realistically, I don't know that we're ever going to get any big, large-scale hydro projects up here in the near future. And freezing due to unreliable power. How much electric heating is there in Alaska where diesel generation is used? Very little. Only what's necessary, like heat tracing for pipes and stuff. But you don't see people running electric heaters in places where you have diesel generation because you're talking a lot per kilowatt hour.
Yeah, your output would be much lower because of the conversion.
Yeah, you're like 38 or 40% efficient
Right.
conversion, where you could be 92 or 8 or higher with a Toyota stove.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting comment from Quebec about a successful run of the river project. We talked about run of the river yesterday afternoon, so we may
Yeah.
want to comment on that.
Yeah, it depends on the size of the community, depends on electric demand and what you're trying to do. Run of river, depending on it, a lot of them that I know about are smaller. You're talking a few tens of kilowatts or maybe a couple hundred kilowatts, as opposed to what we need in some places is maybe a couple of megawatts. So I'm not saying there's not a place for it, but again, it's cost benefit.
So thank you very much. It was a great presentation. Gave us lots of food for thought.